as you know, in 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, and the world as we knew it was being reorganized. Much, in a way, it was a shock to the system, a kind of joyous shock to the system, but forces were kind of unleashed in the world that were unexpected. I was hired by the Department of Labor to teach courses in, get this, identity. The problem was that many large US corporations were entirely focused on defense work. And this defense work was focused on the Soviet Union. And suddenly there was no Soviet Union. So there were no large scale defense contracts to be worked on. So many of the managers, in particular, for instance, IBM, their jobs evaporated. And they had spent their entire careers in IBM from high school right on through. They were certified engineers, but not certified by any kind of National Association of Engineering or any kind of academic certification. They were certified by IBM. So consequently, they had no credentials, and they were in their 50s, and they didn't know who they were. So the New York State Department of Labor instituted these programs to kind of help people figure out how to identify themselves and how to identify their skills in this new era. We were part of that. Very shortly after that, the war in Somalia, the civil war in Somalia broke out. And perhaps a year later, we began seeing under the refugee resettlement program in New York State, and this was in upstate New York, so it's rural. We began seeing large numbers of Somali refugees, Muslims, coming into small or reasonably small communities in large numbers and occupying public housing. And this was a social shock to the system for everybody. I mean, if you can imagine living your entire life in a city like Mogadishu, and then having it suddenly come apart in the way that Mariupol is coming apart, and then finding yourself whisked away to North American farmland, where you now have to build a new life, educate your family, figure out who you are and what your role in the community is, all of these kinds of things. So that was the dilemma that they were living in. I don't want to say they were faced with it, because that kind of suggests that it puts the dilemma in front of you. But for them, the dilemma was all around them. It was the environment, the food, the access, the language. All of these things were kind of, at the outset, seemingly impossible hurdles. So I was hired along with a number of other people under what was called the Liberty Partnership Program to begin to teach ESL, and also to help some students and their families who were later in the process begin to prepare for American citizenship exams and that sort of thing. And it's that setting that I kind of want to focus on for this conversation. My first experience walking into one of these households, I need to say that I grew up in New York. I lived in very diverse communities in New York City with, Lebanese Arabs and Chinese and Eastern Europeans. And so, as well as Haitians and African Americans. So I really would not have thought of myself as a stranger to the kind of environment that I thought I was stepping into. And that was true until the very first moment I walked into a Somali household in public housing in upstate New York. First of all, it was a multi-generational household. And my first thought was, as I walked into this, it was a summer afternoon, and I walked into this dark house. The blinds were closed. It's very hot in there. And I remember I was standing in the kitchen, and I looked from the kitchen into the living room. And the living room was lined with sofas, and all the sofas were these large women wrapped in what seemed to me like oppressively heavy clothing and that sort of thing. And they were just sitting there in the half light. I couldn't see their faces. And I suddenly thought to myself, oh God, I've just stepped into another world. And I was entirely surprised. I didn't expect to see what I was seeing. And the man of the household came out, and we went back outside, and we had a long and very friendly conversation. And he said to me that his daughter was in high school, but that she also needed help with preparations for citizenship exams and that sort of thing. And could I help her do that? And I said, yes, I can. Well, I couldn't do that in school. The language component I did in school, but the other components I did in their household, which was a Muslim household. So there were things that I had to be careful of. And what took me by surprise the next time I went was I walked into the house, into the kitchen. It was about 7 o'clock at night. Everyone had eaten, but they had just cleared the table for my arrival. And they had set up chairs around the kitchen, and 3 chairs at the kitchen table. One for my student, one for me on the other side of the table, and one for her father. And so I sat down and we began to discuss just in general what her ambitions were, what her life had been, what her expectations for her life were becoming. What I remember was the sense of, I would have thought that it was spectatorship, but that wasn't it at all. It was the sense of leaning in, all these other family members kind of leaning in toward the kitchen table, out of the darkness into the light. There was one light over the kitchen table. And I remember thinking, again, this sense of having this feeling of being out of place. That would dissipate over time. But in these first meetings, it was a very strong part of what I was experiencing. I think that my student, Adiba was her name, was frightened. I think she was afraid of failing. I think she was afraid of disappointing me, disappointing her family, being confronted with things that she really didn't have a good sense of. And so we began, with this book that the government supplied, and it began with a Declaration of Independence. It was a remarkable feeling to be sitting there reading over the opening passages of this document, which was foundational, of course, in the United States, to people who had just lost their homes. More than that, to people who had just lost their lives. It was not like an uplifting experience to be able to share this. It was a kind of gentle earthquake to realize the distances that we were speaking to each other across. I mean, imagine saying to someone who's just participated in the slaughter of family members and neighborhoods and friends. Imagine saying to someone, we hold these truths to be self-evident. I mean, it almost felt absurd that there were inalienable rights and that among them were life and liberty. Again, a sense of absurdity, but at the same time, a promise. And I, as a teacher, I have to say that it's very, very rare that I've had that feeling of delivering something that was not just useful information, good to know, helpful, all of those such sorts of things, but that I was delivering something that in and of itself, in its own language, was a promise. And that it was a promise not only of some faraway hope that could be fulfilled perhaps, but it was a promise of an embrace, that your personhood and your deepest dreams could remain alive. This is a very, very, very rare teaching experience.